Hey guys, Joel K here from joelkphotocourses.com, and today I'm bringing you the top 10 tips for editing portraits in Lightroom. Now before we get into the top 10 tips, I'm just going to develop this photo really quickly and we'll be on our way. So I'm going to bring up the shadows, bring up the whites, bring up the vibrance just a touch, bring up the contrast a little bit, maybe bring down the blacks just to make the photo pop a little bit before we start editing. Bring up the blues a bit in her hair. That's kind of nice. We bring down the orange just slightly and the red because it's starting to get a little bit oversaturated, and that looks pretty good. Okay, so you can hit Y and you can see what you've just done to compare. It's just contrasty and a little bit more sort of catchy. So you can hit Y again and hide that. And now, without further ado, let's get to the top 10 tips. Number 1, cropping. Cropping is very important, and there are a lot of rules of cropping, and one of them is that you should put your focal point of the image right on the intersection of thirds. So you can see her eye here is right on that spot where those third lines intersect. Now this isn't a hard and fast rule, but I think for this photo it works pretty well. So there we go. I think that's a pretty good crop. Nice and tight. We can interact with the subject and really sort of get to know who she is. In this case, this is the beautiful Carrie. All right. Tip number 2. Blemish removal. Using the spot removal tool right here, we can remove some of the blemishes. Now this isn't anything serious because she has pretty great skin already, but under the brush tool we can hit heal over here, and our feather is pretty high and our size is appropriate to each of the blemishes that we're going to fix. Now Lightroom chooses a spot to heal the blemish from another spot on her face, and you have to make sure that it picks an appropriate spot. So whenever the program picks a spot that doesn't seem to match, you should probably move the source just slightly so the texture of the skin sort of lines up with what it ought to be. So let's see, that looks pretty good. And there's a little sort of red spot right here. I'm going to tell it to choose right there. So you click on that source spot and you can move it around, and you can see it's going to kind of grab the texture from a different spot on her face. So here we go, just a little bit here. There's a little dot. Nothing serious, but the camera is just not very forgiving when you have tiny little blemishes. Let's see here, a little pore. There we go. This little guy. And that looks pretty good, I think. So here you can see before and after, before and after. Yeah, looks pretty good. Definitely. Okay, tip number 3, skin smoothing. So we can grab the adjustment brush by clicking over here or hitting K, hit New, hold Option and hit Reset to reset the bank of settings that you might have had before. Drag the clarity slider down, pump up the shadows just a touch and the sharpness just a little bit. I find that this is a good setting for smoothing skin tone, and this is what we're doing right now. And getting rid of some of the unwanted contrast that might be on your model's face. So let's just make sure we hit all of the spots that you don't want to draw attention to, and that's generally everywhere on the face except for the eyes, the bottom of the nose, and the lips. So let's just get under her nose a bit here. And you can hit O or click down here where it says Show Selected Mask Overlay, and you can see where you've painted your settings. And if you make a mistake, oops, you can hold Option, that brings up the eraser brush, and you can just erase away that mistake that you made. And here we go, we can see we missed a couple of little spots here, but that is pretty much all we need to do. So you can hit O again, and then you can check to see what you've done by hitting this button here. Now it's taken away some of the contrast in her face, but not to worry about that. What we've really done is we've evened out her skin tone. And if you think it's a little bit too much, you can always go back and click on that little spot where you started the adjustment brush and reduce the clarity a little bit, or maybe bring down the shadows a little bit. Okay, that moves us on to tip number 4, bags under the eyes. Everybody suffers from bags under the eyes. Thankfully, Lightroom knows it, and they give us the ability to fix that a little bit. Now we can just do exactly what we used on the skin in general, But since there's quite a serious negative clarity applied already, I'm just going to bring up the shadows a bit. And you can see as I paint this on right under the eye, it just brings up the tone of the skin under there. And it brings it sort of in line with other spots. Now that might be just a little bit much. We can zoom out to check. It's a little much, so let's bring down the shadows a little bit. There you go. And just in there. Excellent. Now if you have serious creases in there, it might be good to get into Photoshop to get rid of those. But for now, with Carrie, we're looking pretty good here. Before and after. Before and after. All right, tip number 5, the eyes. Now we've got a great bank of settings here for eyes in the presets that they give you. And that's Iris Enhance. And it gives you a bit of saturation, clarity, and exposure. I like to turn up sharpness as well and bring up clarity just a little bit. We're just going to paint that right on her iris. Now you see, it's not really doing too much to her eyes, but we're painting it in the right spot. And we can always go back and change the settings a bit. We might pump up the exposure a little bit. And that should do it right there. Let's bring up the clarity just a little, or the saturation just a little bit more. And there you go. So there's a before and after. So now her eyes are really starting to pop, and you can see you're really drawn into them. And I think that's an effect that a lot of people are really getting into these days, because it really draws you in. So make sure you cover also the catch lights in her eyes just to make them pop as well. And it's nice to have a bit of a dark ring on the outside as well. That really brings some contrast into the eyes. And if you want to, hit New, hold Option and hit Reset. Bring up the exposure just a touch. We can whiten the iris as well, just a little bit, and get rid of any sort of shadows in the eyes. And you can hit New, hit Reset again, and bring up the clarity. And we can apply some clarity to her upper eyelid, and that'll help with the contrast of her eyes. So you can see now, before and after. Let's zoom out a bit. Before and after. So now you're really drawn to her eyes, and that brings us to tip number 6, lips and or teeth. In this case, we don't have any teeth, so we're just going to go to the lips, New adjustment brush, hit Reset, and let's just bring up the saturation. We're just going to paint some saturation onto her lips so that they stand out. She's not wearing any serious lipstick here, but if she is, you could just use the same thing. And let's see, if we bring in a little bit of clarity, it'll add some contrast to her lips and make them pop a bit. Now if she had teeth showing, you would do the same thing, except take saturation down and pump up exposure, and that would take away any yellowing in the teeth. All right, so there we go. Before and after. Looking pretty good. Let's go for tip number 7, dodging and burning. This is an important tip to bring back some of that contrast that we lost by smoothing her skin. All right, let's hit a new brush, reset our bank of effects, and bring up the exposure just a little bit. So this is the dodging process in Photoshop. Grab a nice big brush, about the size of the center of your subject's face, and just paint a little bit of brightness right along the middle. So you can see that might be just a little bit too much. Oh, that's a little bit too little. There. So you can see that really draws your attention to the center of her face and gives a little bit more contrast. So if I click on it and hit delete, you can see what the effect is. I'll hit undo, and it just brought some contrast into the middle of her face. Alright, so now we can continue with dodging and burning. Hit New, hit Reset, and negative exposure. And if you put some negative exposure under your model's chin, that'll really make them start to pop. So I'm just going to draw a little bit of shadow here on her chest and here on her hand a little bit, because it's taking away from the face just a little bit. I'm going to burn this all just a little bit, just to make sure we get most of our attention on her face. Now I think that was a little bit heavy, so I'm going to bring that back off to about well, let's go to -24. So there we go, before and after. You see now the attention is brought up to the face. And we can grab another brush and bring it up a little bit, and we can add a little bit more exposure on the edges where you should have a little bit higher exposure. So we're gonna bring a little bit more to the T area of the face right here, a little bit more to the cheekbones right here, and a little bit to the arm, just right in the center of the arm. And let's see, each of the fingers could use a little stripe of contrast. And there we go. And let's see the center of her hand over here. And that might be just a little bit too strong, so let's bring it down to about there. So there you can see we're really starting to build some contrast and a nice kind of polished look to the photo. Okay, that brings us to tip number 8, hair and details of the hair. So she's got this great colorful hair right here. So we're going to pick a new brush, hit new, hit reset. Let's bring up the clarity and bring up the exposure, and we can just paint some clarity onto her hair, and you can see that it starts to really pop. Let's bring up the saturation as well. You might not want to do this on models that don't have colorful hair, but you can see before and after. It really helps it to start really looking more professional. All right, number 9. Let's bring more attention to her face using a radial filter. That's this little button over here. And we can start in the middle of her face, and we can draw a little sort of circle or an oval depending on your model's face. And for now I'm going to hit inverse mask, and you can see that what that did was apply the settings to the center instead of the outside of that circle. But instead of doing that, because I'd rather lower the exposure around her face than increase it in the middle of her face, I'm just going to bring the exposure down here just a little bit like that. Not too much, that's a little bit much. About, let's see, there, that ought to do it. So there's before and after. No, that's not enough. Let's go to 37. Yeah. Oh, went to 57. Oh, there you go, 47. That's pretty good. So there you can see it's really just drawing your attention right into her face. And you can always go back and change the shape and make sure that it's really fitting your model. So there you go. Now her face is really popping. And that brings us to tip number 10. Tip number 10 is all about sharpening and noise reduction. Now this photo was shot in JPEG, so we don't need to add too much sharpening, but we can add a bit, and probably around 27 would do it. And the big tip here is to hold Option while you're sliding this masking slider, and it'll apply the sharpening only to the edges that Lightroom finds. So instead of applying it to all over her face, we're just going to apply it to her eyes and some of the texture on her shirt. So at about 98, you can see sharpening is only applied to the texture on her shirt and to her eyes. So here's before and after. Whoops. And after. So it's kind of subtle, but you'll notice the difference when you see it. So let's see here. Let's also add some noise reduction. Noise reduction actually has the double effect of smoothing skin. So let's bring up noise reduction about 24. And let's zoom in here on our model and do a before and an after. So you see how skin kind of smoothed out there? Before and after. Now if I really crank the noise reduction, it's super smooth to the skin. Now you might not want to do that, and I generally don't, but there's a setting where you're comfortable and you just have to find that. So there you go. That's the 10 tips for editing portraits in Lightroom 5. As a bonus tip, I am going to apply a couple of other adjustments here, and one of them is going to be a vignette, just a slight vignette, and I'm also going to bring in some split toning. Let's Let's get the highlights going here and the shadows there. And let's move the balance. Let's see what we can do here. There we go. So there you go. Top 10 tips for editing portraits in Lightroom 5. If you want to learn more from me, you can check out my other courses here on YouTube, or you can check me out on www.joelkphotocourses.com. And if you want to see the before and after of that little edit job we just did, here you have a little look here. You can press Y, and that brings you to before and after. You can hit Tab, and that gives you a nice full screen look. If you have any comments or questions, go ahead and leave them for me below. And if you want to see more from me, you are free to go ahead and hit subscribe. And I'm coming out with fresh videos every week, so come and check back later.